start by I'm just going to jump right in. So on behalf of this leadership team, we want to virtually introduce you to Mr. Michael Wilkos. He is the Senior Vice President of Community Impact at United Way of Central Ohio. His team develops effective strategies to improve our community and invest in programs provided by more than 80 funded nonprofit partners to implement their strategies. Prior to joining United Way, Michael was the Director of Community Research at the Columbus Foundation, where he initiated, led, and managed the revitalization in Wyland Park and has managed several other affiliated funds as well. I am providing you with a very brief bio of Michael at his request, at his humble request, because he truly wants to jump right into this presentation today. So I'll make sure to drop his full bio in the chat, and we'll make sure to get that out to all of you today as well. Here's what I can tell you. Michael is truly a sought after presenter on topics ranging from neighborhood revitalization, poverty, economic mobility, segregation, redlining, gentrification, history, and demographics. So now you understand why we really wanted to have him share with us today. So quite frankly, please engage with us, get into the chat, drop any comments or questions you have. We will do our very best to ensure that you're heard. But without any further ado, I want to turn today over to Mr. Michael Wilkos.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sharon, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you today. You always blush when you hear little anecdotes about your resume and work trajectory, but I got to tell you a funny story that in 1980, when I was 13 years old, I got the Ohio Almanac for a Christmas gift. And there was only one city in the state of Ohio that was growing, and it was Columbus. And I really developed this childhood fascination about Columbus, and getting census data is like a Christmas gift you get only once every 10 years. And so it's important for me to really understand in what ways our community is changing, because it really informs how United Way invests in doing social good. But let's talk about what we're known for. And if you think about Columbus, I can't help but think about this really funny 1991 dark comedy with Ed Begley Jr. and Stockard Channing called The Applegates. They were a family of Amazon insects living in the rainforest, and they were upset and wanted to dismantle American global warming behaviors. Think about that, it was 31 years ago. And so they took on a human form, they came to the United States, and their goal was to dismantle an American energy power plant. And in the beginning of the movie, Ed Begley Jr., who's now taken a human form, is looking at US Census data and discovers that the most statistically average place in America is Columbus, Ohio, that there is no interesting, discernible statistics about our city. And the movie takes place in the fictitious town of Median, Ohio. What I love about that movie is that's what we were kind of known for a long time, is just being very average. What I hope to do with you today is bring us to a common understanding of in what ways our community is changing, what are the implications of that. And as you listen to this slide deck, you will get a link to all of the charts and maps you're about to see. I want you to be thinking about, what have you learned? What are the implications and how might you change? And we'll have time at the end for that kind of discussion. So one of the things about Central Ohio is we are growing and growing rapidly. In fact, 90% of the state of Ohio population growth is Metro Columbus, and that was evenly divided. 45% of Ohio's growth is in the city of Columbus, and 45% is in Columbus suburbs. When you look at the growth of the metropolitan region, we've really been growing at about the same rate for 30 years. And this most recent decade, that growth inched up just a little bit. But where that growth occurred did dramatically change. If you look at that period from 2000 to 2010, just 43% of metro growth in the dark blue occurred in Franklin County. In the most recent 10-year period, it was 70%. And for those of us that spend most of our time in Franklin County, there is this impression that all of a sudden Columbus is growing so much more rapidly. That might be true for the central city, but it's not necessarily true for the metropolitan region. So now the city of Columbus is at 905,000 people. The growth we experienced in the last decennial census was the highest percentage increase since the 1950s. So very few of us have lived in this city when it's been growing at this rate. And yet it was the largest numeric increase in the city of Columbus's history. And I think it is surprising when you begin to compare Columbus to other cities that we consider to be high growth markets. The Houstons, Nashville's, Dallas, Washington, D.C. These are the places that a lot of people talk about as being high growth markets. And yet Columbus's growth for the city of Columbus surpassed the growth of many of these West Coast and Sunbelt cities. These regions might have faster growing metros, but when you look at the core central city, Columbus is doing incredibly well. If you think about Columbus, it was the first city created in the country to be a state capital. Columbus started very small. It did not have the industrial strength of Cincinnati or Cleveland. So the growth of the city was really rather modest and rather slow. It really wasn't until the more modern era where you started to see significant growth of the city in population and in territorial expansion. It was really this post-World War II era where Columbus really grew substantially. It is now in 3 counties. It is over 220 square miles and really has this weird geography where very few of the suburban communities within our region actually touch. In fact, just Grandview Heights and Arlington are the only 2 suburbs that have boundaries that align. What's interesting, though, is the territorial expansion of Columbus really has ended. In the last decade, the city of Columbus grew just 1.5% in land area, but we essentially accommodated 119,000 people within that land area. There are no neighborhoods that are untouched by what's happening within the region and the growth that's occurring, and then the implications on the housing market. And clearly, Columbus is starting to go vertical and density is becoming more and more of an issue. These are 3 residential projects that are proposed for downtown Columbus. We see significant residential projects on Livingston Avenue now, the Near East Side, Franklinton. We can see the growth in those urban neighborhoods. And we also see growth in suburban places, whether it be Easton or the one that I always like to point out, which is the top right of your screen, which is Dublin's Bridge Park, an example of the city of Dublin masterfully responding to changing demographics and recognizing that there's not enough built environment diversity in Dublin to really appeal to 2 people. Those are the young folks and empty nesters. They are being driven by lifestyle and convenience, and those 2 things, lifestyle and convenience, are really driving a different kind of built environment. But the scale and diversity and density of what we're starting to see in Columbus is unique for us. And it really is the illustration of a change in how our region is building. When you look at this chart, let's look at the bottom of the chart first. And you can see that the United States previously had grown 9.7% between 2000 and 2010, but slowed pretty significantly in the period of 2010 to 2020. In fact, it was the slowest decennial growth in the United States since the Depression. That is not true. For Columbus and Franklin County, the growth accelerated in this community, despite the fact that you saw a slowdown of about 28% in the country. And what's also unique about the growth of this most recent period is the pretty much equitable distribution of that growth. What you see on this chart, the county grew by 13.8%. In orange are the communities that are growing slower than Franklin County. In light blue are all those communities that are growing at a faster rate. What's important to acknowledge here is that every single community experienced population growth. Those communities that are inner ring suburbs like Grandview and Bexley and Arlington posted growth. And for really the period starting in the 1990s and even in the previous decade, the growth of the region was really skewed to the north end. But you see high growth places like Canal Winchester, Pickerington, and Grove City. This has been the most equitably distributed growth pattern that we've seen in several decades. And if you want to put the size of this growth into perspective, every single day we have 44 more people in this county. And on an annual basis, that's just over 16,000 more people. That's a lot of additional residents. That's essentially adding a city the size of Worthington to Franklin County every single year. So let's look at the whole county. Again, the county grew by 13.8%. That was a significant population growth. What I want to point out on this map are there are 2 areas of population loss where you have multiple census tracts that are adjacent to each other where you have population loss. One of those is right here, starting at Cosi, heading out West Broad and Sullivan. You see a zone of the west side that's continuing to lose households and population as the west side has been struggling with a lot of the issues of social ills, and particularly the drug epidemic. The other interesting thing is the area of the south side of Columbus, really starting at Nationwide Children's Hospital, moving south along Parsons, Miller, Kelton, Whittier. Those areas also saw population loss, not because that area is struggling, but because that area is changing pretty dramatically. And there are often renter families with school-aged children that are now being replaced as property is getting flipped to home ownership. And often those new purchasers are either single individuals or they could be couples that do not have school-aged children. I point this out because if you look at the map of growth and decline, you might look at this map and say, oh, the west side and the south end are still really struggling. Population loss does not translate into whether or not a neighborhood is doing well or struggling. In the case of the west side, it illustrates a struggle. In the case of the south side, it indicates dramatic change in family structure and who lives in households because of the appreciation of that area. But the reality is, despite a lot of the conversation, which I'm going to talk about existing neighborhoods and how this growth spurt has really impacted certain parts of our county, the reality is much of the growth of the last decade was still greenfield development, closer to 270 or outside 270, but still within Franklin County. It wasn't really until the second half of the last decade where you started to see a significant movement inward. What we still are trying to uncover is what are both the short-term and long-term impacts on COVID and the interest in living an urban or more dense lifestyle. What is also really important narrative here is that despite the fact this was the largest numeric increase in our city's history, all of the net growth of the city of Columbus was due to increase in diversity. This was also a true statement for Franklin County. The need for all of us to have a strong diversity, equity, and inclusion platform. It's not just about where we're headed as a community. It's been where we've been heading for quite some time now, and it is responsible for all of the growth in Franklin County. And I do believe that this demographic shift will continue. Here's the data. I certainly don't need to read the slide. You can scan the numbers for yourself. But again, it is significant that the white population slipped slightly despite this surge in population growth. But what you're seeing is that Black, Asian, other two or more significant increases. I want to point out that Hispanic is either white and Hispanic, Black and Hispanic. So Hispanic is inclusive of the rows above. What we're seeing across the country is more people have been getting in touch with how they identify. So some people who may have identified as white or Black alone 10 years ago might actually be identifying themselves as other or two or more, but you are seeing this across the country and certainly here in Franklin County. If you look at the map of diversity, everywhere in green is getting more diverse. The diversity index for Franklin County moved up from 50 to 60. What I find fascinating about this map is almost every single census tract in Franklin County has become more diverse. This isn't just something happening in the city of Columbus. It's not just an inner ring suburb. It's not a suburban. It's everywhere. There are a few places on this map that show a drop in diversity. This is the census tract right next to Hollywood Casino. We have an area just north of Ohio State, and this tract just south of John Glenn Airport in Whitehall. Don't be confused in that these are still very diverse places. They were incredibly diverse in 2010. They just don't happen to be as diverse simply because there was a change in the housing stock in those census tracts. But it is illustrative that diversity is significant across this region. But despite the increase in diversity, we still are a highly segregated region. If you look at this map, the areas in red show the most homogeneous places. Now, it would make sense that this portion of Franklin County, south of Grove City, it's very rural, very agricultural, not a lot of people live there. And one might think, yeah, I expect those places to be homogeneous. But as you zoom in to the county, and by the way, if you don't look at census tract data a lot, every census tract represents about the same number of people. So as you can see, this is a very large piece of land, but that's as many people as that little census tract near the core. So let's zoom into the city. Where are the most homogeneous places? German Village, Bexley, Grandview Heights, all the way through Arlington, the core of Clintonville, and Worthington. What is interesting is that the most homogeneous places are both in the city of Columbus and in inner ring suburbs. And in many ways, they still represent the racial demographics that were established because of redlining and segregation. The demographics of a Clintonville and Arlington in 2020 look a lot like the demographics they had in 1920 when people of different races or religions were being held out of those places. But yet, if you look at Dublin and New Albany, they are homogeneous economically, but Dublin and New Albany are not homogeneous through the lens of race. These newer, more modern suburban places may not have that economic integration, but communities that have been built entirely since the post-civil rights era do look different through the lens of race. So as we look at where are the fastest growing census tracts in Franklin County, it was interesting that 3 of them were greenfield locations and 3 of them were existing neighborhoods near the core. So you have 2 areas near Dublin, but in the city of Columbus in the top right of the map that show at 142 and 116%. The area to the top left is that Cosgray, Hayden Run area, really between Dublin and Hilliard. And then the next 3 were either downtown Columbus or what we refer to as 5th by Northwest, where you see that 92% increase as the typology of the building stock really began to change. Even a place like Whitehall has reversed its fate after 50 years of population loss. There is some new housing being built in Whitehall, but mainly the change in demographics, often older single people who are moving to appropriate housing that is right for where they are in that life cycle are being replaced with families. Often those families are new American families with school-age children. So Whitehall schools are also growing in enrollment. And downtown, of course, experienced a significant population surge. This is true for every downtown in the country. Even communities like Youngstown, Cleveland, and Detroit, which continue to lose population overall, saw significant increases in their downtown population. But downtown was really part of a broader urban trend. If you look at the core of our city, this would start in the area that I call 5th by Northwest, down through Grandview Yard, in through Harrison West, downtown, Wineland Park, King Lincoln, and parts of German Village. The core of the city experienced a 44% increase in population. Now, this is significant because the infrastructure is already in place, and we clearly need a more robust environment where people can be shopping and experiencing daily routine of life. It has been suggested that people spend 7 times more in their spending power within a mile radius of where they live than where they work. So if you get more people living in the core of the city, that is going to support a more robust retail environment. So now let's jump into some of those neighborhoods that saw the most significant change. Linden is now growing for the first time in 60 years as efforts to stabilize and invest in Linden are starting to pay off. I think there's a more, if you will, sinister issue that's driving the population growth of Linden that I'll get into in a second. What's important about North and South Linden that I'm referring to here as Greater Linden, there are 12 census tracts and 11 of the 12 showed population growth. That's important because that 7% population growth wasn't driven by one large new housing development built in a single tract. You're seeing all of Linden kind of responding and reacting to this robust population growth. And the one tract that lost population was statistically insignificant at less than a 1% decline. What is really surprising for me as someone who likes to study neighborhoods is the fact that Linden grew by 7% in people while it was continuing to lose its housing stock, or it lost 3.7% of all housing units while it was growing in people. What happened in Linden was this decades-long trend of fewer and fewer people living per unit has stopped and reversed itself in lots of Columbus, really due to the chronic underbuilding that we've been experiencing for the last decade as we have a population growth. In Linden, the number of people per housing unit went from 2.2 to 2.6. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence that suggests as people are getting evicted or as young people are not able to maybe get an apartment as soon as they'd like because rents are so high, or people are living additionally with roommates so they can afford those increases in rents, that places like Linden, as an example, are having to accommodate some of that housing vulnerability, and it's manifesting itself in more people per unit. When you specifically look at Linden, it had the second largest drop in vacant housing of any part of Franklin County at a 39% reduction in vacant units. There are 1,083 less vacant structures in Linden now than 10 years ago. When we think about the Linden housing stock, it is a relatively simple housing stock, and it is not always very old. And so it's relatively easy to bring some of these buildings back online. What we know from city records, however, is that the effort to remove blight in Linden has really started to pay off. The city did achieve just over 400 demolitions, but the number of vacant and abandoned units is down by about 1,100. The census is not tracking a specific unit over time in this data. What it does suggest for me is that while the city removed 400 units of blighted housing, that was probably beyond the point of reasonable salvation, that the private market responded and 600 to 700 units were brought back online as either people purchased those properties and renovated them, or people who've been sitting on property found an economic viability with increased rents to bring that property back online. The bottom line is there's a lot less distressed real estate in Linden than there was a decade ago. When you look at Linden's demographics, it is worth recognizing that while the neighborhood is up just 7%, which is good, but not super fast, Linden showed an increase in all racial demographics. The white population is up slightly, but the Black population also barely increased. Linden is becoming a far more diverse neighborhood as different kinds of people are moving into Linden. And you're going to see that across the board in every neighborhood that I show you today. So now let's move up to Northland. And this might be the most dramatic change that I've seen in our county. It is a rapidly growing area. I call this Greater Northland. If you look at this map, the boundary to the west is Interstate 71. I kind of max out at 270. I do not include Easton, and it goes down to the tip of Northern Lights. This is a much larger geography than the official Northland boundary, but I think it's important to show a broader trend here. Every single one of these census tracts on the north end of the city showed population growth, but what do we know about Northland? You don't really see much construction. So how is it that every single one of these neighborhoods is showing an increase in people? Let's unpack that. Northland added almost the entire city of Bexley in population growth in the last 10 years. You see the new Columbus Metropolitan Library branch here on Carl. I think it's important to acknowledge if Northland was its own city, it'd be the 6th largest city in the state of Ohio. This is a big place, and it's important to Columbus, and Northland is growing faster than Columbus and Franklin County. And yet, the number of housing units in Northland barely budged. There are just 484 additional housing units in Northland, but there are 14,000 more people living there. Again, the number of people per unit in Northland had been dropping. That has stopped and reversed itself. But more importantly, Northland had the largest drop in vacant housing units as any zone in Franklin County. 48% of the vacant housing units have been brought back online. This is a picture taken from Google Street View in 2011 that shows an apartment complex on Northtown Boulevard that was offline. If we go back in our heads 12 years, it was a rough housing market. And Northland is not a strong, at that time, Northland was not a strong neighborhood in a weak housing market, which was going to lend itself to a number of units that were offline. But the housing stock in Northland is relatively simple, and it's not very old. So when the market responded and the population growth of the region began to escalate, there was a lot of inventory that was able to come back online in Northland. Here's that same apartment complex taken from Google Street View, and you can see it is now occupied. And so while the total number of housing units is up just 1%, the number of occupied housing units is up 7% because of the reduction of vacant and abandoned housing, but the number of people is up 15%. And diversity, of course, is driving Northland. Well, you can see the white population in Northland slipped only slightly. That is not too dissimilar to what happened in the city of Columbus overall. The increase in the Black population looks comparable to what happened in Franklin County overall, but particularly look at the growth of the Asian population, where Northland now has a significant Asian community that did not exist 10 years ago. And that community is often Nepali Bhutanese. On the third week of March, the American Community Survey data will be released. That will give us a deeper look into new Americans and children and poverty. And I would be willing to come back and show you updated information. As an example, you'll see here in a minute, while the Asian community is quite large, the current data doesn't tell us the uniqueness of the Asian community. When you look at Northland in particular, it is worth reflecting. In the 1997 economic census, Northland zip code had the highest retail sales of any zip code in the state of Ohio. That clearly plummeted as retail sales moved to either Polaris or further out toward Easton. But then 10 years after the mall was demolished, a local geographer pulled every business permit issued by the city of Columbus along that Morse Road corridor. And of the 180 businesses that the city issued permits to, the vast majority of them had either an African or Latino surname. So now the vacancy rate of commercial space along Morse Road is almost non-existent. And in many ways, Morse Road is just as local, it's just as entrepreneurial as what the Short North was during the height of, say, the gallery hop, but this was not done with the same intentionality. Really, Northland is the epicenter of the global diaspora that is kind of playing out on our planet, is really coming to Northland, and it's giving it incredible economic vitality. So now let's move over to the Near East Side. While the Near East Side population growth was almost negligible, and I think that is really surprising to folks, that the Near East Side only increased by 554 individuals. Most of that growth has happened in just the last couple of years, as the Near East Side has really been going through a much longer transition of change. Despite the growth is low, the demographic shift in the Near East Side has been the most dramatic of anywhere in the city, but also similar to Northland and Linden, you've seen a huge drop in vacant housing. Near East Side came in third with a 34% drop in vacant housing, or there are about 1,200 less vacant structures on the Near East Side than 10 years ago. But it's here where the narrative really begins to change. And that is the white population on the Near East Side nearly doubled from 19 to 37% as the Black population dropped by a similar percentage, now down to just 58%. If you look at the Near East Side, I broke it into a north of Broad and south of Broad. When I say south of Broad, it's from Broad Street down to Livingston between downtown and Bexley. North of Broad would be Broad Street to 670 downtown to Bexley. If you look at north of Broad, this has been a long-standing center of the Black community, and the racial demographics have been stable north of Broad until really the last 20 years. And really in the last 5 years, you've started to see a significant change in the racial demographics north of Broad. South of Broad has had more of this roller coaster experience, where if you look at the city of Columbus, the percent of Black or African-American population has been somewhat on a slow and predictable increase. So we have to have thoughtful conversations when neighborhoods have dramatic shifts in their racial composition, because south of Broad in 2020 now has the same racial distribution that it had in 1960. We are not always having really good, thoughtful, non-emotional conversations about race and class, in particular when neighborhoods experience these dramatic ups and downs, because most of us, our collective memory is what we've experienced in the previous 20 or 30 years. We don't often look at a neighborhood's racial change through an 80 or 100-year lens. And if we look at the Near East Side in particular, which is wrestling with density and new construction, you'll see that the population of the Near East Side actually is still down a little bit from where it was in the year 2000, but the population loss has flatlined and stopped. And now the Near East Side is heading into a period where there will be continued population growth, but it is a fraction of the growth that it once had in, say, 1960. So when people talk about there's no grocery store, there aren't walkable affordable retail goods and services, or there isn't a diversity of retail goods and services. When you look at the Near East Side, it's lost about 2/3 of its peak population. And in 1940, the Near East Side comprised 16% of the entire population of Columbus. It's now just 2% of the city of Columbus. I often hear conversations in particular neighborhoods about why is the city not doing something, or why is the city doing X when they should be doing more for what's happening in my geography. And I need to remind people that now the city of Columbus is 906,000 people and it's 220 square miles, and establishing policy for the diversity of what Columbus now is in 2020 is sometimes a hard thing to do. And particularly 8-9 years ago, I was giving presentations around the proliferation of vacant housing and how that is pulling neighborhoods down. And in under a decade, we have a very different set of circumstances. We see this throughout our city. I selected a handful of properties that sold not too long ago, and then I wanted to show the current price, given the fact we're having conversations with realtors. We know this, but look at the property in the bottom left, going from 27,000 to 300,000 in a very short period of time. However, when you go to Google Street View and you look at these particular properties and you look at that price prior to that year, you can see that most of these things were very distressed properties. And so we don't know how much money has been invested in them. But what we do know is neighborhoods like north of Broad and now south of Broad are experiencing what I would call unsustainable increases in property values, which are causing rapid change in racial demographics, which are changing those communities culturally. And we need as a community to really talk about these things with greater sensitivity, I should say. So now let's jump out of neighborhoods and look at the big picture. What you see in this map of Franklin County in green are all the places where the Black population increased. And in fact, there's surges in the Black population, all leaving central core neighborhoods. In red and orange are those places where the Black population is dropping. So portions, a couple places in Linden did see significant drop in Black population, even though the population was up slightly. But across the Near East Side, south of Children's Hospital, heading down Parsons Avenue, and north of the Ohio State University. One of the things the census does not tell us: how much of this change is gentrification, how much is displacement, and how much of it is choice. As the Black population continues to surge in suburban areas, that is not particularly gentrification, that is movement of choice. The largest drop in the Black population was in Franklinton, where the Black population dropped almost 61%. What you see here from Google Street View is the former Riverside Bradley has been replaced by River Ridge apartments, which are really 1- and 2-bedroom apartments that demographically look very different than the CMHA property that was there before. But on the near northwest side and the south side, there continue to be places of significant racial change. And where's the Black population going? It is rapidly suburbanizing. The 3 census tracts with the largest increase in the Black population are all adjacent to one another. They're all in the city of Columbus, immediately adjacent to the city of New Albany. And the Black population in this far northeast part of Columbus went from 875 to 2,800. Even New Albany schools now has 10% of student enrollment in New Albany are Black students. And a year ago, New Albany Plain Local High School officially started an NAACP chapter. And what you see here is a Google satellite of Upper Albany West, which is the census tract with the largest increase in the Black population at 273%. So what's happening with the white population? While the white population dropped just 0.4%, what you see on this map in red are the areas where the white population has dropped considerably. And those are 3 areas: Northland, Westland, and Eastland. And I would call those greater Northland, greater Westland, greater Eastland. These are the areas where the white population dropped dramatically. And the white population in Franklin County fell from 69.2 to 60.6. If the rate of change continues this decade as last, there will no longer be a racial majority in Franklin County by the 2030 census. And those particular areas in Whitehall, where you saw a 72% drop in the white population, Eastland and Northland as well. Often throughout this presentation, you'll see the diversity index. What's interesting is despite a significant drop in the white population, these areas have been able to maintain a racial diversity. The white population, however, is increasing in a few places. It is really fascinating to me as a demographer that the largest increase in the white population was all happening in neighborhoods that had been previously redlined and segregated. The number one increase in the white population is the census tract that has the Urban League and the King Arts Complex. And you can see here, again, just images from Google Street View from 2011 and then 2020. Two houses on St. Clair Avenue really represent what's happening in Tract 29. But if you look at the Near East Side and south of Maine, the diversity of those neighborhoods went from very low diversity. And by the way, the lowest diversity index recorded in any neighborhood is 18. The highest diversity is 78. What's interesting, suburban Columbus and Columbus's suburbs, particularly Westerville, Gahanna, Reynoldsburg, Pickerington, those places are getting far more diverse because particularly upper income Black households are moving northeast and east. And yet urban neighborhoods that were previously segregated and redlined are also becoming more diverse because that's where white consumers are moving. Again, now we have to have an issue of gentrification, displacement. Who is leaving tends to be Black families, often with school-age children. The white households that are moving in do not have school-age children. When you look at the Asian population, you saw a significant increase. We have the largest Asian population in the state, 74,700. The percent of Franklin County that identifies as Asian went from just under 4%. It's approaching 6%. The map that you see, however, is not a map of change. It's a map of where the Asian population is located. In green are the areas of more significant Asian population. What you'll see is starting at Ohio State University, running up through Bethel and Sawmill and up into Dublin. You'll see a significant Asian population in New Albany. What's changing, however, is out here in Reynoldsburg and Northland. They have emerged as new Asian communities. However, the Asian community that's in Dublin looks different than the Asian community that's near campus, which looks different than the Asian community in Northland. And in after March of this year, I'll be able to give a presentation that dives a little deeper into those cultural communities, and you'll see more data coming out. Here's a map that shows the increase in the Hispanic or Latino population in green. I thought this was important to show change as opposed to where the Hispanic or Latino community is located. It is interesting that the few places you see in red where the Latino population dropped, that tends to be the center of where the Latino community is located. Northland. This is the census tract with the continent at 161 and 71. This is now the West Side. You see places here in Whitehall. As cultural communities get established and people live in our city longer, they tend to become more adventurous with where they're comfortable in living. That's what you're seeing on this map in green. I often say to folks, if my job moved me to Tokyo and I began to work at the United Way of Tokyo and I don't know Japanese, I'm going to live in a Western neighborhood. If 10 or 15 years later, I'm still in Tokyo, I've picked up a lot of things and I might not need to live among people who look or talk or act like me after I've been there a while. We're seeing that with Columbus's new American communities. So the most diverse place in Franklin County is the far west side, just out 270, essentially a 270 in West Broad, on the other side of the highway from Westland Mall. And that diversity index range is at 78 out of 100. And you can see that percentage of the white population there has dropped as that community's become more diverse. It is interesting that the most diverse census tracts in our county tend to be in neighborhoods where the built environment is really from the 1960s and into the 1970s. The most homogeneous census tract is in Upper Arlington along Lane Avenue, immediately south of Whole Foods. This is where we have to acknowledge how history has brought us to this environment of diversity or homogeneity. In a place like Upper Arlington, like many communities all across the county and the country, they were built in an environment where restrictive covenants were used prolifically. And so the area that we know is the Country Club District, the 1,000 acres from Lane Avenue and south of Lane, was unveiled in the 1920s. The picture you see on the top right is from the original marketing brochure when what we refer to as King Thompson developed that land. Upper Arlington, like many places, used restrictive covenants. This is a chart from Patricia Burgess's book, Planning for the Private Interest, written and published by the Ohio State University Press about the use of restrictive covenants in Columbus. And this slide was created by the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. As you look at the right side of this slide, the terms that you see here are really uncomfortable and they are offensive. However, those words were printed thousands of times in those restrictive covenants in our community in places like Worthington, Clintonville, Grandview, and Arlington, Bexley, or places like German Village. And the racial diversity of those places today are still really a remnant of those policies from decades ago. I love this picture of King Lincoln Bronzeville. This was actually from the Blanchard report, but this was a neighborhood that was deemed hazardous by those homeowner loan corporation assessors who would look at both the physical environment or the demographic environment of certain neighborhoods. And King Lincoln Bronzeville was one of those neighborhoods that was called hazardous. And even recent studies that have looked at the modern day impacts of redlining have looked at places where even in Columbus, if you think of Grandview and Clintonville, Driving Park or Westgate, we have neighborhoods where the built environment might be the same architects and the same builders. Some of those areas would be in green, tier 1. Some of those areas might be in the pink, tier 4, which means they are hazardous based on either physical conditions or social characteristics. And people are still, unfortunately, building wealth off of those policies where the policy has been changed, but the impacts of that policy are still manifesting itself in present day issues. Similarly, now we're comparing the map on the left, which is that redlining map. Again, the areas in pink, I'm sure you've all seen this more times than you want to. The areas in pink are all those areas that were tier 4. The map on the right is a 2010 map created by the Ohio State University that looks at where the private sector was continuing to issue predatory loans, and you can find some very clear physical boundaries. Here we have Parsons Avenue between downtown. This is all German Village, Marion Village, Schumacher Place. Here we have the area south of Children's Hospital. This is the railroad track that runs north along Interstate 71, which has been a race demarcation line for a century. And here you have the curve in the river around Franklinton. So this is West Broad and Sullivan. We, the people, have said the government can no longer be doing these things based on race and class, but unfortunately, the private sector is continuing to issue predatory loans and policies in those same neighborhoods that those policies existed 85 years ago. So very quickly, I think this is really important because there's lots of conversation about gentrification and displacement. They feel and act exactly like the same thing, but they are very, very different. Here is a tool, not from the census, but it was created from the Institute on Metropolitan Opportunity at a Minnesota law school. I encourage all of you to go to it. It's interactive and it looks at every single census tract through race and age and income. And what this tool revealed for our region is the fact that just 4% of Columbus neighborhoods experienced gentrification in this period of 2000 to 2016, and that's what you see in blue. The areas in the rust or red color are all of those places that have been getting poorer. There have been 10 times the number of neighborhoods getting poorer than the number of neighborhoods getting wealthier. If you do not see color on this map, like in Upper Arlington and Grandview or Clintonville, that's because it was wealthy in 2000, still wealthy in 2016. If you don't see color here on the Erie side, that's because it's still relatively the same economic profile as in the year 2000. While just 4% of Columbus had recorded gentrification up until the year 2016, I think all bets are off for what's happening now. This tool reported the only neighborhoods that experienced gentrification between 2000 and 2016 were essentially white neighborhoods along the High Street corridor, north and south of downtown. Kind of pay no attention to this blue here because it's mostly floodplain. I believe that this gentrification has now dramatically shifted to the Near East Side, and it's dramatically shifting into Franklinton as developable sites have really become expensive along that high street corridor. Yet, despite the fact that there has not been a lot of gentrification, everybody is experiencing what I consider to be housing displacement because our rents and home prices for everybody are going up faster than our incomes. And too many of us are using the gentrification narrative that we've taken from Seattle and Denver and Boston, and we've transplanted that to Columbus. This is really an issue of housing demand and supply are pushing people out. Northland has considerable increase in housing costs, despite the fact that Northland continues to get weaker and poorer because there's more and more people competing against each other for a fixed supply of units. What's driving this is we've been chronically underbuilding for a decade, and I know you all know this, but this is something that has been a realization that has come late for folks. In 2020, it was the most construction we've experienced in 15 years. However, we still underbuilt in 2020 just to meet the population growth of that year. Most people say that we need 14 to 15,000 units of construction just to meet the population growth for that year. We probably should building 21,000 units if we're going to make up for the fact that we've been underbuilding by 5,000 units every year for the last decade. When you compare Columbus to other comparable markets like Austin, Nashville, and Charlotte, we are not growing nearly as fast as them, but we're not growing that much slower when you look at how few units we are building compared to those other markets. The Columbus market is considerably larger than Raleigh, but they are delivering more product. I believe there is an anti-density movement that continues to build in Central Ohio that worries me for the future because we have continued growth and we have to figure out where that growth is going to occur. We are now confronted with a scarcity of available housing stock that I do not need to tell any of you. But more importantly, the housing stock we are building doesn't match the demographics of how we're growing, meaning many communities still zone for larger single-family homes on larger lots, and that is not the kind of typology. When you look at the kind of households we're adding, that's really not what they're looking for. This is why, in my opinion, so much of the growth of the last decade moved into Franklin County and particularly moved into the city of Columbus because Columbus has a more inclusive zoning and land use policy that is allowing greater density and smaller units to be built. So as I look at the census, there's 9,400 less vacant housing units now than 10 years ago. And by the time the census was done, we had a lower housing vacancy rate than San Francisco. Now that we have so few number of vacant housing units, I worry about the growth that's about to come because in the last decade, we were able to accommodate 23,000 additional people because they utilized existing housing that had already been built. It just wasn't being used. Now, a lot of the product that's vacant has some significant barriers to why it continues to be vacant. So as you think about our community, some places are really almost unrecognizable. Places like Dublin, which has gone from 4,000 people to 50,000. And you can see this really quickly with some Google Street View, which I just love. Here's Bridge Park 10 years ago, the same view today on Google Street View. Or we have Henderson Road in Northwest Columbus, that same view of that street taken today. Here's a picture of High Street in South Campus, not too far from where I live, and what that same view looks like today as High Street continues to fill up. We also see East Long Street in downtown Columbus has had a similar experience. And then, of course, the short north, which seems to be a flurry of new construction every year with more to come. So when I look at the census, what did I learn? That regional growth has been consistent with previous decades, but it has shifted into Franklin County in a significant way. Neighborhoods that have been losing people for decades, like Linden, are now growing, and places like Northland, which really aren't adding housing units, have become high growth neighborhoods. There have been significant increases in diversity in suburban Columbus and the suburbs, and a significant increase of white people moving into the core neighborhoods, and all of the growth of the city and the county is due to an increase in diverse populations. And yet, we are underbuilding, inadequate construction, and unit typology And with this dramatic decrease in vacant housing, I'm worried that the market no longer has that product to absorb the growth, which leads me to that prediction that the housing price appreciation we've been experiencing with both for sale and rental product is probably here to stay. The region's going to continue to reshape itself, and it's going to have to. Here's a picture in that 5th by Northwest area just off King Avenue, as small single-family homes are really being surrounded by 5- and 6-story apartment buildings, where the city of Columbus is really encouraging that density, which is also responding to all the jobs and cranes that are going up at OSU Wexner Medical Center and West Campus. I believe that the growth we just experienced is going to accelerate. What you see here is Intel in the bottom right, that new $2 billion Wexner Medical Center expansion in the top left. Nationwide Children's has continued to add thousands of jobs. And what you see in the top right is what will ultimately be the West Campus over there at Lane Avenue near Kenny. These are examples of 5,000 and 10,000 or more jobs being added that are supporting living wage jobs. The growth of the region will accelerate, but we've not been able to get production of housing anywhere close to match that in the last decade, which means we're going to have to probably double production in order to accommodate this growth. It is predicted, and I believe that is a safe prediction, that we will add another 1 million people by 2050. And what you see here is the reinvention of High Street in the University District. We're going to have to build more housing, more compact housing, more dense housing, and a diversity of housing typology, like accessory dwelling units, like duplexes on vacant lots in existing neighborhoods, in order to accommodate that growth. When I think of the 35 years of studying this community, we've never been adding people more quickly. We've never been more diverse, and Columbus has never been more influential on kind of a national stage as it is representative of a new economy. And we have decisions to make. There are some really big decisions that are about to come our way. One of those is the Linkus proposal from CODA, which will be a multi-billion-dollar investment in transportation infrastructure. Columbus is rewriting its zoning code. Will that encourage density along transit corridors and different kinds of housing typology? And the Columbus bond package will be up to voters again soon. In the last bond package, we put $50 million into affordable housing. It leveraged $250 million and created 1,300 units. It is the first time the city said affordable housing is just as important as curbs and sidewalks and streetlights. And I think there was a universal acceptance and people were pleased with how that bond package was deployed in 2019. It will be interesting to see what the voters are getting to vote to increase in affordable housing next round. And so the challenges have never been more complex or significant, but I really do think we're at a critical decision point, and the growth of the region is not guaranteed if we don't make wise decisions. And with that, I hope you learned something about what's happening in Central Ohio. I went a little over, but I'm sure there are some questions, and we'll pause to take those. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back to you, Sharon.
Michael, I'm over here mind blown. So thank you. And none of us, I can tell you, I've been in the chat, no one is bothered that you took a few extra minutes to get all that in, because it was awesome. So with that, Lindsay has been so kind to open up all of our opportunity to share. If you have any comments or questions, please chime in, unmute yourselves, and ask any questions that you have of Michael, any clarity that you may need as well.
Yes, Buzz Thomas here. How are you?
Good, Buzz. How are you?
I am great. And as I wrote, I am a Michael Wilkos groupie.
There it is. I love it. I love it. I am now a groupie. I'm total
What was
groupie.
the most stunning change that you thought you saw between in the last 10 years?
I think the most stunning is, for years, because I work in the health and human service sector, because we fund 90 nonprofits working on basic needs and student success, I've only ever heard anecdotally about the impacts of housing instability, of evictions, and the fact that I'm seeing Northland and Linden both pose such significant population growth while either still losing housing or barely adding housing. that we can no longer make assumptions of neighborhoods based on maybe the physicality of what we see. Sure, we all know that Italian Village or Franklinton's going to be on the rise because we see 5-story buildings replacing, former closed gas stations. But the fact that Northland added 14,000 people while it only added 484 housing units, that's kind of bananas to me, right? I think the other thing is we know that nationally there's this flip-flopping going on, right? Where people of, families of color, particularly Black families who have historically been denied access to suburban communities, that movement of Black middle class and high income households to Columbus suburbs really didn't even start to happen until after 2000, but it really picked up speed in this period between 2010 and 2020. And I guess the third one kind of there, Buzz, is I'm really worried about places like Eastland and Westland or the Hilltop. If our region grows by another 1 million people, and if 15% of the region's in poverty and 15% is the working poor, that means 300,000 more economically vulnerable people will live in this region by 2050. Where do you want to put 300,000 people who struggle? Because they're probably not going to end up in Delaware County, and they won't end up in places like Dublin or New Albany. And that means places like Northland and Eastland and Westland are going to carry the brunt to handle that burden of responsibility. And if poverty is moving away from downtown in a pretty predictable way, then it's those zones built in the 1960s and 1970s. They're not new enough to be competitive. They're not old enough to be interesting. They don't have architectural ornamentation. And so it is a place where new American families are going to go because the housing stock is still of good quality, but it's going to need some significant capital improvements because that stuff is hitting 50, 60, 70 years old. And I don't think we have the infrastructure to stabilize the Hamilton Road corridors and the area from the Hilltop all the way out to Hollywood Casino. So there's a lot going on there.
So do you think that because of that there's a cultural shift in terms of the ethnic makeup of Northland, and that it's more acceptable to have more people in a smaller space? Do you think that's part of the rise in the density?
It certainly is. I mean, someone like me as a single individual might have been living in a 2-bedroom apartment, right? In an apartment complex on Morse or 161. And as I feel like the apartment complex doesn't look as good as it used to be, and I want a greater amenity package. Well, where is someone like me as a working professional going to go? You're going to move out to Polaris or further out to Easton. You're going to jump 270 to look for that newer apartment complex. I get replaced by a family of 4 or 5 from Bhutan. So the population of that unit just went from 1 person to 5, but the number of housing units hasn't changed in the neighborhood. So one of the things that I find refreshing and valuable is that while the economic stability of a place like Northland is dropping, the loss of average household income is being offset by an increase in people, and it's creating an entrepreneurialism along Morse Road that is probably very envious of a lot of other cities, because you really can't find retail vacancies on that Morse Road corridor. So that's a good thing. Interestingly enough, Hamilton Road at Eastland, all the way from Interstate 70, down to Refugee, has not had that increase in vitality because it hasn't really experienced that global change the way Northland has.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Michael, this is Kim Mills. First of all, thank you so much. This is an awesome resource for all of us. My question is, if we gave you the power to do 3 things, what would your top 3 be?
Oh, that's a good one. It's something I think about all the time, so I don't have to really think too hard. Number 1, it would be making sure the CODA Link Us proposal is as inclusive and aggressive as it can possibly be. And right now, if you've not looked into Link Us, it is representative of a West Broad Street bus rapid transit, East Main Street BRT, all the way to Reynoldsburg, and then Olentangy River Road would be completely rebuilt. What's important here is I'm not just talking about some buses. We're talking about stations with platforms where you no longer have to pay. When you get on the station, that transaction has already occurred, and because there is a significant fixed infrastructure, you begin to build density around those stations. They will function like light rail without that significant cost. So it's billions of dollars, but Linkus is also about bike lanes. It's also about rebuilding streets, and it's about refitting those corridors so they can support that growth. That's number one. Number two is going to be that zoning code. And when I look at a place like Austin, Texas, the zoning code reform there got derailed because the NAACP and what I would say the German villages of Austin, they were both worried about that zoning code. Low-income neighborhoods of color were worried about a zoning code reform because they thought it was going to encourage more development and lead to gentrification and displacement. And keep in mind, Austin is growing much more rapidly and the home prices there are nearly double ours. The German villages of the world were worried because they thought a zoning code reform was going to lend to more things like the Pizzuti project at the corner of Whittier and Jaeger. So those two groups of neighborhoods worked together and they stopped that. So I think the zoning code reform is number two. And I do think number three is for us to be really, really aggressive with that bond package to say, look, the federal government, the state of Ohio, they are not coming to anybody's rescue when it comes to building affordable housing. We are going to have to do it ourselves. And then that means we, the people, should be investing the city's bonding capability to be the instigator of and facilitator of affordable housing. And if I could wave my magic wand, I would put 500 million in the upcoming bond package for affordable housing, which should be able to jumpstart, 2 billion in construction and 13,000 units, if I could make my three picks.
I have a question. So I live on the hilltop. What would you recommend for the hilltop? What can help turn the tide over here?
Thank you. First of all, I think there needs to be a better understanding of a collective impact model, which is how do you get lots of people together all working in the same direction, but they stay within their lane. As an example, in Wineland Park, where I live, the revitalization of Wineland Park has been significant and it gets a lot of accolades, and Wineland Park was really easy. It's next to the Short North, it's next to the Ohio State University, so it has a built-in infrastructure for its revitalization. But more importantly, Wineland Park had a collective impact model where United Way, the Columbus Foundation, Annie E. Casey Foundation, City of Columbus, campus partners, and others were all working together. Wineland Park, that revitalization started in 1995. It's been 27 years in the making, but it also was only successful because the Ohio State University purchased the Broad Street Management portfolio, which had 1,300 units in 7 Columbus neighborhoods. And Ohio State could have flipped that real estate to a private sector investor. And instead, a new nonprofit owner and manager was created to stabilize the most vulnerable people first. So what is the thing that needs to happen in Hilltop? It is not going to turn around with a single intervention. Those interventions must be, and in alphabetical order, education, employment, health, housing, resident engagement, and safety. And there will be multiple strategies that need to be deployed in each of those major buckets. But the Hilltop is going to have those long-term committed funding partners like a United Way, Casey Foundation, Columbus Foundation, and others, because even in Wineland Park, different people like JP Morgan Chase in the early years funded the housing revitalization and education. United Way had a significant lead. Then it became the Columbus Foundation. Then it became the Annie Casey Foundation. The bottom line is over those 27 years, there was always somebody in charge of investing those dollars, and somebody was also in charge of that collective impact model, which brought all those people together so they were sharing information and moving in the same direction. That kind of infrastructure is absent in most of our neighborhoods. And if you don't have an anchor institution like Nationwide Children's Hospital, which is leading the work on the South Side with Healthy Families, Healthy Neighborhoods, or campus partners, which led it in the University District. You've got neighborhoods like the Hilltop, which are kind of swimming, right, with all these huge housing and demographic and population changes and things like addiction. And now with a robust real estate market and a depletion of vacant housing, I guarantee you the Hilltop is going to start to see appreciation and movement of people in, and that's really going to be a displacement model. So we can talk in greater detail offline about what it takes to do collective impact, but I highly recommend, there's a Stanford Social Innovation article written a few years ago, which really highlights the best techniques to do place-based neighborhood revitalization.
Michael, if I remember correctly, Columbus is, I think you described it as the most economically segregated city outside of Austin, Texas. So if, and I'm making the assumption here, my wife's a retired Columbus public school teacher. She's always taught at in the inner city. Poverty is at a root cause of so much of the housing difficulties. How do we address things like education, health, positive health outcomes without addressing poverty?
Well, you have to address the poverty, right? I mean, so, I think the other thing is that we're too often looking for, a silver bullet approach. And I guess that's what I really want to respond back again about Hilltop and what you just asked, Buzz. And that is, it will take time. And let me pause. There's a organization called Move to Prosper, and they are essentially helping single women with school-age children move out to the suburbs. And they're looking for, they've got to have a transit rating, a school rating, stable employment, all of these things. And a lot of people are like, wait, you're just encouraging people to leave urban neighborhoods and go to the suburbs. Yes. However, even when a place like Wineland Park revitalizes as quickly as it has, it still took a quarter of a century, right? And if you are a single person who's struggling, you don't have time to wait 20 years for that neighborhood to turn around. So there's something to be said for, we do need to look at particular families and give them the right environment so those kids can be successful. But I want to share with all of you some school data that I just received that I'm still processing. 2 years ago, 41% of Black third graders in Columbus City schools were reading on grade level. 41%. Because of the impacts of COVID, now just 16% of Black third graders in Columbus schools are reading at grade level. But for all of Columbus, it's just 23%. If you look at that same data for Whitehall, 2 years ago, 49% of all children in Whitehall were reading at grade level. Now it's 24%. But Gahanna, Canal Winchester, Southwestern, Westerville have all seen about a 20 to 25% reduction in third grade ELA scores. The COVID pandemic has been a disaster for kids. And now Intel comes to town, and I'm excited and delighted. And based on what local economists have printed, about a third of the jobs that Intel creates do not require an education higher than high school. And they all have runways of different training, right? Some jobs need a few weeks, some jobs need a year, right? But they're providing this incredible opportunity and pipeline for living wage employment. It's no different than what the steel plant did for my grandfather working in Youngstown, or the fact that my father was a union electrician. People were able to move to Youngstown and have a living wage job and support a family, and that has disappeared in much of Ohio. It has not disappeared here. However, in places like the Hilltop or the Near East Side or Whitehall, we are failing those children. And so while we need a collective impact model that's going to concurrently look at education, employment, health, housing, safety, and resident engagement, we have to really be mindful, are we all doing everything we can to make sure an entire generation of kids who are born and raised here are not having their educational trajectory completely interrupted? We have had in this community for some time a pat on the back because Columbus, the Columbus Metro, Franklin County, we have a much higher level of educational attainment than the state and the country. That is not because that K through 12 pipeline has been connected in this community. It's because we are a huge importer of 18-year-old talent. And if you look at the 30 high schools that send the most kids to the Ohio State University, 29 of the 30 are suburban Cleveland, Cincinnati, and then Centerville and Dayton. And we keep enough of those young people who are imported here because they find these economic opportunities. I'm worried that the pipeline of kids that are born and being raised here are going to be lost, and a place like Intel is not going to find us attractive in 10 or 20 years if we don't get a handle on that. We can all, right, volunteer our time to make sure that a kid in our neighborhood is reading where they need to be reading, or we could all go into classrooms when we can and do mentoring and reading and doing those kinds of things to make sure we don't lose that generation of kids. That was a long answer, but it is a complicated question that you asked.
I agree wholeheartedly with you, Michael. I guess one of the frustrating things for me is when the funding sources, which the state legislature was supposed to come up with an answer for, I don't know, what, 10, 12 years ago. It seems as though they throw money at a problem that they either refuse to acknowledge or is ill-defined. And they would like to have a check mark in a box when they get reelected that says, hey, I gave a 23% increase in student funding without addressing, and I say this because vicariously for 20 years, I've lived through my wife with dealing with children who have needs, not just the educational needs. They don't need more teachers, but they need psychologists. They need mentors. And so I guess I get stuck on figuring what can we do? As realtors, Columbus Realtors, there's certainly enough of us that we could provide some people power. But I think, I guess I'm frustrated seeing a long-term solution to where we are now. And as Ms. Williams, who at one time was president of the school board, and talked about when she became president, she had some real definitive ideas about melding a relationship between the business community and the education community. So she made a list of the top 50 corporations and went to see their CEOs. And she got a very chilly response. And after 10, she stopped, thought about it, went back and said, I just want to ask you one question. I know that your kids go to St. Charles or some other place. Where are you going to get your employees? And I think you touched on that with Intel. If there are not people, then we won't have business. So I guess, it's like good ideas, but how do we turn that into a reality?
Well, there's lots of things there. And, without going into even longer response and explanation, I've a couple things to say. I can't comment on, school funding. It's not my area of expertise. It's been a battle that's been going on for a long time. What's happened in the last couple of years, though, has been significant. And I think that even myself, right? I mean, I just got that data around third grade attendance, or I'm sorry, third grade ELA, which is English Language Arts. And by the way, Arlington, Bexley, Dublin, New Albany, they also saw a drop in third grade proficiency rates. But the Dublin, New Albany, Upper Arlington, they were seeing a 6 to 8 to 10% drop in third grade proficiency. The Gahanna, Canal, Winchester, Columbus, Whitehall, Southwestern were 22 to 30% drop, right? So those school districts that had both economic and racial diversity have been hurt the most. And children of color in every single school district, the educational gap between white and non-white students has widened. We can advocate for policy change, but much of the success of a kid is not from the classroom. It's happening in the home and the neighborhood. And that support needs to happen both at the end of the school day, lunchtime, on the weekend, and in the summer. And that's where your bandwidth, right, of just who you are as individual people or groups of realtors, adopting some of the schools where that third grade reading is now the lowest in the community, just spending an hour a week helping a kid read and giving that one-on-one time, that's a pretty important gift you can be giving. That's not about trying to change the way the state of Ohio funds schools. And the impact of your giving your time, that might manifest itself in improved scores over a longer period of time, but it needs to be done. And those children are suffering, and they unfortunately are coming from families or live in neighborhoods where, that infrastructure is not probably going to present itself. But also vote for the CODA levy.
Okay.
Oh, hey, Barbara.
Hey, I've heard you for 10 years, and I have to tell you, if anybody ever knew their business, you certainly do. And I am so grateful that you're sharing it with us. And I have to say that now you don't only know it, you own it. So I'm really proud of you and so glad to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm always there for you, Barbara, when you've got a group of realtors, you want a Columbus presentation, you know where to find me. And by the way, thank you for my delicious Christmas treats that you sent my way.
Well, you're welcome, but you're amazing. And it is just the depth of what you know and how you know to fix it. If we could just have 10,000 of you, we'd get someplace, but thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And again, I will, Sharon will have the entire slide deck. So all of these maps and charts you will all have access to. And if you want me to come back in a couple months, we can do a deep dive into what the poverty numbers in New American and cultural communities and all that new data that comes out of the ACS data that comes out third week of March.
Great.
Michael, I also want to be fair to the folks who had some questions in the chat who didn't get a chance to be heard. Would you be open to me capturing those and just sending those your way and providing some response? I don't want them to not have been included. We just ran out of time.
Absolutely. I just copied the chat and I'll look those over and I can work on responses. And if there are any of you that would have another group that you're involved with, a church group, a civic association group, some other place in the community where you think a presentation like this or a shorter version has value, I would be willing to do that.
All right, you guys, we'll go ahead and end this presentation for today. Thank you so much for your attendance. We will get the slide deck out. Michael's so kind to share that with us. We'll get that out to you. We'll get responses out to you as well if your question wasn't answered, and we'll have Michael back here in a couple months.
Thank you so much, and everybody have a great day.